There is a version of Pierce Brosnan the world agreed to love. The tuxedo. The jawline carved from something more permanent than stone. The voice that could make danger sound like an invitation. For a generation of moviegoers, he was the ultimate fantasy. The man who walked into every room as though the room had been waiting for him. But here is the question nobody thought to ask while they were admiring the suit. What does it feel like to be the man inside it? Was it because behind the most iconic spy in cinema history lived a story so different from the legend that it reads almost like two separate lives? A boy abandoned before he was old enough to understand what abandonment meant. A man who watched the love of his life, and then his daughter, be consumed by the same merciless disease. An actor who was handed the role of a lifetime, had it ripped away, fought for years to reclaim it, and then walked away from it, carrying wounds the cameras never caught. Pierce Brosnan did not become James Bond despite what he survived. He became Bond because of it. Because a man who has truly lost everything carries himself differently. The stillness is real. The calm is earned. The smile hides something the script never wrote. This is not the story of a movie star. This is the story of a boy from a small Irish town who spent his entire life searching for a home he never had, and found it, finally, in the most unexpected places. Before we go further, if you've ever felt like an outsider in the very life that was supposed to be yours, stay with us, because that feeling is exactly where this story begins. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room. Not the loneliness of a crowded party where no one knows your name. This is something older, quieter, and far more damaging. It is the loneliness of a child who looks up expecting a face and finds an empty doorway instead. Pierce Brendan Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953, in Drogheda, a small town in County Meath, Ireland. A place of grey skies and narrow streets, where life moved slowly and expectations moved even slower. His mother, May Smith, was young, determined, and utterly unprepared for what came next. His father, Thomas Brosnan, left before Pierce was old enough to form a single memory of him. No goodbye, no explanation, just absence, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shapes everything anyway. And then his mother left too, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. And May Smith was a woman with ambitions and a desperate need to build something for herself and her son. She traveled to London to train as a nurse, chasing the only future she could see. A future that, for the moment, had no room for a toddler. Pierce was handed to his maternal grandparents, Philip and Kathleen Smith, in the quiet Irish town of Navan, County Meath. He was barely 1 year old. Think about that for a moment. Before he could walk steadily, before he could string a sentence together, and before he understood what a family was supposed to look like. His already looked like a missing persons report. His grandparents were kind, they were warm. But kindness cannot fill the specific shape of a mother's absence, and no amount of warmth can answer the question a small child asks in silence every single night. Why didn't she stay? Pierce never asked it out loud. Not then. But the question lived in him like a splinter, too small to see, too sharp to ignore. When his grandparents died, the arrangements shifted again. Pierce moved in with an aunt, then a family friend. Each transition delivered the same quiet verdict. You are someone else's problem now. He was not abused, he was not starved, but he was passed along like something that didn't quite fit anywhere. A boy with no fixed address in the most important sense, the sense that has nothing to do with geography. School was no sanctuary. At St. Kieran's CBS in Navan, Pierce was the boy without a father, without a mother at home, without the invisible armor that comes from knowing someone is waiting for you when the bell rings. He was quiet, watchful. He learned early that observation was safer than participation, that if you studied the room carefully enough, you could anticipate where the next hurt was coming from. He drew. He painted. He disappeared into art the way only children who need to escape somewhere find a place to go. It was not yet a passion. It was survival. And when he was 10 years old, his mother reappeared. She had built her nursing career in London, remarried, started a new chapter. She sent for him. And so Pierce Brosnan, at an age when most children are worried about school tests and bicycle tires, packed what little he had and moved to London, a city that spoke the same language but felt entirely foreign. To live with a woman who was technically his mother but felt, in the most honest parts of him, like someone he was still getting to know. He would later describe those years with a restraint that itself speaks volumes. "I was always the outsider," he said once, quietly, without bitterness. "I was always looking in." That sentence is worth sitting with, because the boy who was always looking in grew up to become the man the entire world couldn't stop looking at. But that transformation, from invisible to iconic, would cost him more than anyone watching from the outside could ever have imagined. And it started with a stage. A borrowed costume and a city that didn't care whether he made it or not. London in the late 1960s was not a city that waited for anyone. It moved fast, it spoke loudly, and it had absolutely no interest in a quiet, displaced Irish teenager who arrived with second-hand clothes, an accent that marked him as foreign, and the particular kind of emotional guardedness that comes from spending your entire childhood learning not to need too much from anyone. Pierce Brosnan was 16 when he enrolled at the Elliott School in Putney, South London. And he was behind academically. He was socially invisible. And he carried with him the specific burden of a boy who had been shuffled between households for so long that he no longer expected any place to feel permanent. But London, for all its indifference, offered something Navan never had: possibility. And possibility, for a boy like Pierce, arrived in the most unlikely form: a fire-eating act. At 17, he stumbled into a part-time job with a small traveling circus, to learning to breathe fire as a street performer. It was not glamour. It was not art. It was a teenager standing in the cold, performing a trick that could genuinely kill him, for crowds of strangers who tossed coins and moved on. But something happened in those moments that no classroom had ever managed to produce. People looked at him. For a boy who had spent his entire life feeling invisible, passed between grandparents, aunts, family friends, arriving in a foreign city where no one knew his name, the experience of commanding attention was not just thrilling. It was transformative. It was the first time in his life that the world paused, even briefly, to acknowledge that he was there. He wanted more of it. At 18, he found his way to the Drama Centre London, one of the most demanding and respected acting schools in the country. The acceptance was not guaranteed. The school was fiercely selective. And Pierce arrived with no formal training, no connections, and no particular reason for the faculty to believe in him. Beyond the raw, unquantifiable quality that great acting teachers spend their careers learning to recognize. They recognized it. The Drama Centre's method was not gentle. It was built on the philosophy that actors must excavate themselves, that the material for great performance lives not in technique alone, but in the willingness to reach into your own history, your own wounds, your own unresolved questions, and bring them to the surface where an audience can feel them. For most students, this was confronting. For Pierce Brosnan, It was almost too easy. He had an entire childhood of material to work with. The absent father, the mother who left, the years of being passed along, the silence he had learned to wear like a second skin. Suddenly, in the controlled environment of a rehearsal room, all of that had a use. All of that had value. And the very things that had made him feel broken were now the tools of his craft. He graduated in 1975 and moved immediately into theater, cutting his teeth on stage productions that paid little and demanded everything. He worked with the York Theatre Royal. He played challenging roles. He was not an overnight success. The industry rarely rewards patience with speed, but he was growing, quietly and steadily, into something real. And then came a television role that changed his trajectory. In 1982, he was cast as Remington Steele, a charming, witty, fictitious identity invented by a female detective agency to give their operation more credibility. And then inhabited by Pierce with such effortless charisma that audiences immediately forgot they were watching an actor. He looked like he had been born for television. He moved through scenes with a confidence that felt unlearned, and the camera found him the way cameras occasionally find certain people. As though it had been waiting, America noticed. And with America's attention came the first real whisper of the name that would follow him for the rest of his life: James Bond. But before that door opened, it would first be slammed shut, violently. And the reason it closed had nothing to do with talent. It had to do with love. There are people who enter your life and rearrange it. Not gradually, not politely. They arrive and suddenly the furniture of everything you thought you understood about yourself is in a different place. And you realize, with a clarity that is almost frightening, that the arrangement you had before was never quite right. Cassandra Harris was that person for Pierce Brosnan. He met her in 1977 at a party in London. She was Australian-born, strikingly beautiful, fiercely intelligent, and already a working actress with a presence that filled whatever room she entered. She was also, at the time, married to someone else. The businessman Dermot Harris, son of the legendary Irish actor Richard Harris. Pierce saw her across the room and felt something shift. He was 24 years old. She was 29. And the connection between them was the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't wait for convenient timing. They became friends first, and the way people do when circumstances require patience. And then, after her first marriage ended, they became everything else. They married in 1980. Pierce adopted her 2 children from her previous marriage, Charlotte and Christopher, without hesitation and without condition. For a man who had grown up without a father, without a fixed home, without the certainty of being chosen, the act of choosing these children was not just generosity. It was a declaration. This is what a family is supposed to look like, and I am going to build it. For the first time in his adult life, Pierce Brosnan had something he had never truly had before. A home, not an address, not a roof. A home. The kind measured in laughter over breakfast, and the specific comfort of knowing that when you walk through the door, someone is genuinely glad you're there. Cassandra gave him that. She gave him roots when his entire life had been defined by uprootedness. And then she got sick. And in 1987, Cassandra was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Pierce was 34. Their son, Sean, had just been born. The life they had built together, warm, creative, full of the particular joy of 2 people who genuinely chose each other, was suddenly living in the shadow of something neither of them had the power to negotiate with. What followed was not a story of giving up. It was the opposite. Pierce stepped back from everything the industry was beginning to offer him. Opportunities, auditions, the mounting momentum of a career that was clearly heading somewhere significant, and placed Cassandra at the center of his world. He was present, ferociously, deliberately, completely present. He drove her to treatments. He sat beside her through the hours that have no glamour and no script. He held the family together with a quiet determination that those who witnessed it never forgot. He would later say, and with the measured honesty of a man who has survived something that changed him permanently, "You learn very quickly what matters and what doesn't. The rest just falls away." For 4 years, they fought. And for 4 years, Cassandra fought harder than anyone who loved her thought was humanly possible. She was, by every account of those who knew her, extraordinary. Not merely in the way people become extraordinary when they are ill, but in the full sense. Funny, sharp, unwilling to be defined by what was happening to her body. But on December 28, 1991, Cassandra Harris died. She was 43 years old. Pierce was 38. He had 3 children, a career that had survived on hold, and a grief so total that people who knew him from that period describe him as a man who had gone somewhere inside himself that was very hard to reach. He kept working, because working was the only architecture that remained, and because 3 children needed a father who showed up, because the alternative to forward motion was a stillness he could not afford. But those who watched him on set in the years immediately following Cassandra's death saw something in his performances that had not been there before. A weight behind the eyes, a quality of loss that no acting school teaches because it cannot be taught. It can only be lived. And the boy who had built his craft from the wounds of an abandoned childhood now had a new wound, deeper than the first, permanent in a different way. And the cruelest irony was waiting just around the corner. Because the role that would have changed everything, the role that had been dangled in front of him, the role that the entire industry had already begun whispering his name alongside, had slipped through his fingers, not because he wasn't ready, not because he wasn't right, but because the contract that held him had no mercy clause for a man sitting beside his dying wife. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of coincidence. It doesn't announce itself as punishment. It arrives dressed as timing, as circumstance, as the neutral language of contracts and clauses and business decisions that have nothing personal in them. And yet the effect is as precise as a blade, because the cruelty of losing James Bond was not simply professional for Pierce Brosnan. It arrived at the exact moment when he had the least left to lose, and took something anyway. But let's go back to 1986. Remington Steele had made Pierce Brosnan a recognizable face on American television. The show had run for 4 seasons, and somewhere in the middle of all that charisma and comedic timing, the producers at Eon Productions, the company behind the James Bond franchise, had begun paying close attention. Roger Moore had played Bond since 1973, and by the mid-'80s, it was clear that the character needed to be handed to a new generation. And the shortlist was not long. Pierce Brosnan's name was at the top of it. In 1986, Eon offered him the role. Officially. Not a screen test. Not a conversation. An offer. The role of James Bond, the most iconic fictional character in cinema history, was handed to a 33-year-old Irish actor who had spent his childhood being invisible and his early career learning to make rooms pay attention to him. He said yes. The Living Daylights was announced. Publicity began to build. And the machinery of a Bond film, enormous, expensive, global, started moving in the direction of Pierce Brosnan's face. And then NBC exercised a clause. Remington Steele, which had been quietly declining in ratings and was widely expected to be canceled, was abruptly renewed by the network. Specifically, industry insiders have long suggested, because of the Bond announcement. The renewed interest in Pierce drove the show's value back up overnight, and NBC had the contractual right to hold him. And he was legally bound. He could not walk away. Eon could not wait. Timothy Dalton was cast as James Bond. Pierce Brosnan watched from the sidelines as the role he had already said yes to was given to someone else. Not because he had failed an audition, not because anyone had decided he was wrong for it, but because a television network had done the arithmetic and decided his value was worth more to them than his dream was worth to him. He handled it publicly with a grace that, in retrospect, I deserves more recognition than it received. There were no outbursts, no interviews filled with bitterness. He spoke about it carefully, professionally, with the controlled restraint of a man who understood that the industry was watching how he responded, and that how you lose something often matters more than the losing itself. But privately, those closest to him knew the wound was real, because this was not simply a missed opportunity. This was the culmination of everything he had worked toward since the drama center, since the fire-eating act in the cold London streets, since the moment a displaced Irish teenager decided that the feeling of being seen was worth dedicating his life to. He had climbed all the way to the door marked James Bond, and the door had been locked from the inside by someone else's contract. And Cassandra was already sick. So Pierce Brosnan entered the late 1980s carrying two impossible things simultaneously: the grief of watching his wife fight for her life, and the professional wound of having been this close to the role that would have defined his career, only to have it handed to someone else while he stood there, contractually frozen, unable to do anything but watch. He did not collapse under the weight of either. He made films, some good, some forgettable, and he remained present for his family with a devotion that never wavered. He rebuilt his professional reputation one careful role at a time. And he waited. Not passively, not with resignation, but with the specific patience of a man who had learned from childhood that the things worth having rarely arrive on schedule. By 1994, Timothy Dalton had stepped away from the role. Eon was looking again. And somewhere across the Atlantic, Pierce Brosnan's phone rang. But answering it, and wearing the suit at last, would come with a price that the franchise had never asked of any Bond before him. Because this time, he would step onto that set having already lost the most important person in his world. And that changes a man in ways that no amount of preparation can anticipate. The call came in 1994. Eon Productions wanted Pierce Brosnan. Again. 8 years after the first offer had been pulled away by a television network's contractual arithmetic, the role of James Bond was being placed back in his hands. And this time, nothing was in the way. Nothing except grief. Cassandra had been gone for 3 years. Pierce was 41 years old, raising 3 children, and carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years being strong for everyone around him while quietly running on empty inside. He was not the same person who had first been offered the role in 1986. How could he be? The years between that offer and this one had taken things from him that no career achievement could restore. And yet, he said yes, because Bond was not just a role. At this point in his life, it was a lifeline, a structure, not a reason to stand up straight and walk into a room and be for a few hours every day on a film set. a man who had all the answers and none of the wounds. If that sounds like escapism, perhaps it was, but it was also courage. The quiet, unglamorous courage of a man who had every reason to retreat from the world, choosing instead to walk directly into its most scrutinized spotlight. GoldenEye was released in November 1995. The verdict was immediate and overwhelming. Pierce Brosnan was James Bond. Not in the tentative, let's see how the audience responds sense. In the absolute, this was always inevitable sense. He inhabited the character with a completeness that silenced every critic who had spent the previous decade wondering whether the franchise had a future without the right face to carry it. He had the physicality. He had the wit. He had the stillness. That particular quality of a man who is never rattled, never rushed, never visibly afraid. See the quality the character demands above all else. And he had something none of his predecessors had brought to the role in quite the same way. A sadness behind the eyes that the script never explained, but the audience felt in every scene. They felt it because it was real. Bond is a character defined by loss, by a past he never discusses, by connections he cannot afford to make, by the emotional distance he maintains from everyone around him as a matter of professional survival. Pierce Brosnan understood all of that, not as an acting choice, but as lived experience. He had been keeping people at arm's length since he was a toddler in Navan. He had learned emotional distance before he learned to read. The performance was extraordinary precisely because the artifice was minimal. 3 more films followed. Tomorrow Never Dies in 1997. The World Is Not Enough in 1999. Die Another Day in 2002. Each one a global event. Each one adding another layer to a legacy that had, by the early 2000s, become unassailable. Pierce Brosnan's Bond grossed over $2 billion at the worldwide box office. He had not merely rescued a franchise that was beginning to feel its age. He had reinvented it, given it an emotional register it had not previously possessed, and handed it back to a new generation with enough momentum to carry it forward for decades. The world looked at the tuxedo and saw James Bond. And those who knew Pierce looked at the man inside it and saw something more complicated. Because the schedule was merciless. Film after film, promotion tour after promotion tour, the relentless machinery of a franchise that size, consuming every available hour. His children were growing up. Sean, the son born the year Cassandra was diagnosed, was a teenager. Charlotte and Christopher, the stepchildren Pierce had adopted and raised as his own, were building their own adult lives. And Pierce was perpetually somewhere between a film set and an airport, playing a character whose defining quality is never being in one place long enough to feel anything. The loneliness that had defined his childhood had found a new form. He was, once again, the outsider looking in. Only now the room he was looking into was his own family. And the glass between them was made of schedules and commitments, and the particular imprisonment of being the most visible face in a global entertainment franchise. And then, in 2004, it ended. Eon Productions informed Pierce Brosnan that his services as James Bond would no longer be required. The decision was made quietly, efficiently, and entirely without his input. Daniel Craig was being considered for a grittier, more stripped-back reimagining of the character. And Pierce, now at 51, was being retired from a role he had never been ready to leave. He found out, by some accounts, before the official announcement through the press. He had not been fired from a mailroom this time. He had not been held hostage by a television contract. He had simply been told by the industry that had handed him its most coveted role that the role was being handed to someone else. Again. The wound was different from 1986. Deeper in some ways. And because this time he had worn the suit. He had earned it, frame by frame, across 4 films and a decade of his life. He had given Bond something real and permanent and irreplaceable. And the ending had come not with a conversation, but with a press release. He spoke about it later with the careful honesty of a man who has made peace with something that still occasionally aches. "I felt I had more to give," he said simply. "But it wasn't my decision to make." That sentence, short, measured, carrying everything it doesn't say, tells you more about Pierce Brosnan than any Bond film ever did. Because the man who had been left behind as a toddler, passed between households as a child, held hostage by a television contract as a young actor, widowed in his 30s, and now retired from the defining role of his career by a studio decision. That man had learned, over a lifetime of losses he did not choose, that the only thing you can control is how you carry what cannot be changed. And what was waiting for him on the other side of that loss was something the franchise could never have scripted. Something quieter, something real, something that had been growing, slowly and steadily, in the years between takes and press tours, and the relentless performance of invincibility. There are things the universe does that defy the language of coincidence. They are too precise to be random, too targeted to be accident. They arrive with the specific weight of something that was always going to happen. And the helplessness they produce is unlike any other kind, because there is no one to confront, no decision to reverse, no argument to make that changes anything at all. Pierce Brosnan already knew what ovarian cancer looked like from the inside, and he had watched it take Cassandra over 4 years, had sat beside her through treatments and hospital visits, and the slow, cruel recalibration of what a normal day means when someone you love is fighting for their life. He had held her hand. He had held the family together. He had buried her in 1991, and then done the only thing available to a man with 3 children and a grief too large to look at directly. He kept going. Charlotte Harris, Cassandra's daughter. At Pierce's adopted child, the girl he had chosen as his own without condition when she was still small, had grown into a young woman of remarkable warmth and talent. She had her mother's presence. She had the particular quality of someone who fills a room not through volume, but through genuine attention. The rare gift of making whoever she was speaking to feel as though they were the most important person in the space. She had also inherited something else from her mother. And in the late 1990s, Charlotte was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The same disease, the same daughter's body, a different generation, and the same merciless verdict. Pierce was still filming Bond films when Charlotte's illness became serious. He was standing in front of cameras, playing the most invincible man in cinema, performing coolness and control, and the absolute unshakability of a character who walks away from every catastrophe without a scratch. While privately living through something that no amount of training, wealth, or fame provided the smallest protection against. Think about what that requires of a person. To walk onto a film set and inhabit a character defined by the complete absence of vulnerability, while carrying a weight that would have brought most people to their knees. To smile for promotional photographs, to give interviews, to perform night after night, the fiction of a man who cannot be touched. And while the thing that was touching him most deeply had no script, no resolution, and no guaranteed ending. He did it because the alternative was to stop. And stopping, for Pierce Brosnan, had never been something his history had taught him how to do. Charlotte Harris died on June 28, 2013. She was 41 years old. 2 years younger than her mother had been when ovarian cancer took her. The same age bracket. The same disease. Now, the same man left standing at a graveside, trying to locate the words for a loss that language was not designed to carry. He had now buried the woman who had given him his first real home, and the daughter she had left behind. He had watched the same illness move through 2 generations of the same family, and he had been present for both, in the fullest and most painful sense of the word present. And there are no interviews from this period where Pierce speaks about Charlotte's death with anything other than the quietest possible restraint. Not because he had nothing to feel, but because some grief is too large and too private to translate into the currency of public conversation. He acknowledged it, he honored it, and then he protected it from the world that had always wanted more from him than he was obligated to give. What he did do, and what speaks more clearly than any interview, was channel the loss into action. He became one of the most prominent advocates for ovarian cancer awareness and research funding in the world. He donated. He spoke at events. He used the very visibility that had sometimes felt like a burden as a vehicle for something that mattered more than box office numbers or franchise continuity. He could not save Cassandra. He could not save Charlotte. But he could refuse to let their deaths be only private. And in making them mean something beyond the boundary of his own family, he found the only answer grief ever honestly offers. Not closure, not healing, purpose. And yet, even in the middle of all of this, the losses, the bond years, the public life that never paused long enough for him to fully breathe, something else had been quietly, steadily growing. Something that had started, almost improbably, on a film set in Mexico. Something that would become the second great love story of his life. And this one, unlike so many chapters before it, would not end in loss. It began, as the best things in his life always seem to, without warning. In 1994, the same year Eon Productions called to offer him bond for the second time, Pierce Brosnan attended a party in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. He was 41 years old, 3 years into the grief of losing Cassandra, and living the specific kind of life that famous, eligible, recently widowed men are expected to live. Appearances, events, the performance of being fine. And then he met Keely Shaye Smith. She was a journalist, television presenter, and environmental activist. Brilliant, outspoken, and entirely unimpressed by the particular brand of charm that Pierce had spent years perfecting for cameras. She didn't need anything from him. She wasn't auditioning for a role in his story. She was simply and completely herself. And that quality, in a world that had spent years projecting fantasies onto Pierce Brosnan's face, it was more disarming than anything he had encountered in a very long time. They talked for hours that first night. Not about Bond, not about Hollywood, about the ocean, about environmental destruction, about the particular grief of watching the natural world be consumed by indifference, about things that mattered to both of them in the quiet, private way that things matter when no camera is watching. Pierce would later say he knew that night, not with the dramatic certainty of a film scene, and no swelling music, no perfectly lit moment, with something quieter and more reliable than that. The simple, grounded recognition that this person made sense to him, that the version of himself he was when he was with her was closer to the real one than almost any version he had shown the world before. They were married on August 4th, 2001, in a castle in Ballintubber, Ireland. Pierce had come home. To the country that had formed him, to the landscape that had shaped his earliest understanding of beauty. To the land he had left as a teenager, with nothing but displacement and longing, and the stubborn belief that something better was possible. They have two sons together, Dylan, born in 1997, and Paris, born in 2001. Combined with Sean, Charlotte, and Christopher, Pierce had built the large, complicated, love-filled family that the small boy in Navan had never dared to imagine for himself. Keely has been, by every account of those who know them, the architecture of his stability. She is not a background figure in his story. She is its co-author. She challenged him to be more present, more honest, more willing to exist outside the performance of composure that fame demands. She gave him permission to be uncertain, to be tired, to be the version of Pierce Brosnan that doesn't have an answer for everything. There is a detail from this period that says more than most interviews. When the tabloids began commenting on Keely's weight, with the particular cruelty that celebrity culture reserves for women who dare to exist in public bodies that don't conform to its specifications, Pierce responded not with diplomatic neutrality, but with unmistakable directness. He called her beautiful. He called her his anchor. He made it clear, publicly and without hesitation, that the opinions of people who had never sat across from her at breakfast were entirely irrelevant to him. And that response, instinctive, protective, completely unbothered by how it might play in the press, revealed something essential about the man beneath the tuxedo. The boy who had spent his childhood never being chosen had become a man who chose fiercely and without apology. And from that foundation of genuine love and hard-won stability, Pierce Brosnan did something that surprised everyone who thought they already knew his story. He started over, not desperately, not reactively, but with the deliberate, unhurried intention of a man who had finally, after 40 years of searching, found solid ground beneath his feet. And what he built on that ground was more interesting than anything James Bond ever did. After Bond, the industry wasn't entirely sure what to do with Pierce Brosnan. That is not an unusual problem for actors who have been too completely identified with a single role. The tuxedo had been so perfectly tailored, the association so total, that casting directors looked at his face and saw a character rather than a performer. The franchise had made him globally iconic, and in doing so had, paradoxically, made him harder to cast. He could have retreated. He could have accepted the comfortable irrelevance that swallows many actors once the defining chapter of their career closes. He had the money, the family, the houses in Malibu and Ireland and London. He had every material reason to slow down, and every emotional reason to simply be present for the life he had fought so hard to build. Instead, he got interesting. The Matador in 2005 was the first real signal. Pierce played a burnt-out, deeply strange professional assassin. Nothing like Bond, nothing like anything the industry had previously asked of him. With a loose, unguarded, genuinely funny vulnerability that startled critics who had spent years assuming they already knew what he could do. He received a Golden Globe nomination. More importantly, he proved something to himself and to anyone paying attention. The tuxedo was a costume. The actor was something else entirely. Mamma Mia! In 2008, confirmed it in the most unexpected way possible. And he sang. Gamely, imperfectly, with a complete willingness to be ridiculous in service of joy. And the audience loved him for it. Not despite the imperfection, but because of it. Because there is something deeply appealing about watching a man who has spent decades being asked to be flawless finally shrug and say, "This is what I actually sound like, and I don't particularly mind." The film made over $600 million worldwide. Pierce Brosnan, for the man Hollywood had retired from its most invincible role, was now one of the highest-grossing actors of 2008. But the work that reveals him most clearly in this period is quieter than either of those. He painted. Throughout his life, beginning with those early sketches in Navan, the displaced child who found in art a space that asked nothing of him but attention, Pierce had maintained a private practice as a visual artist. In the years after Bond, he began taking it seriously, not as a hobby, as a discipline. His paintings, loose, emotionally direct, often depicting the natural world and the human figure with a rawness that his performances occasionally approach but rarely exceed, have been exhibited internationally and have raised significant funds for ovarian cancer research. He paints, by his own account, because it is the one place where no one is watching, where there is no franchise, no audience expectation, and no camera finding his best angle, where he is simply a person making something, alone with the silence that has followed him since childhood, and learning, finally, to find it companionable rather than threatening. He has spoken about his Irish identity with increasing depth and openness in recent years, about what it means to have left and returned, about the particular relationship a person has with the landscape that formed them before they were old enough to choose anything, and about County Meath and the gray skies and the narrow streets that he once could not wait to escape and now returns to with something very close to reverence. He supports environmental causes with the same fierce consistency he brings to everything that actually matters to him. Not performatively, not for publicity, but with the sustained, unglamorous commitment of someone who genuinely believes the planet is worth fighting for. His foundation, with Keely, that has directed millions toward environmental protection and ovarian cancer research. He has turned the two greatest losses of his life, Cassandra and Charlotte, into something that outlasts both the grief and the fame. And through all of it, the painting, the advocacy, the quieter films, the life in Malibu with Keely and the children, there is a quality that emerges from every account of people who know Pierce Brosnan outside the frame of a camera. Presence. And not the manufactured presence of a man who has been trained to command attention. The real kind. The kind that comes from someone who knows, with absolute certainty earned through absolute loss, that the moment in front of him is the only one he is guaranteed. The boy who spent his childhood feeling like a temporary arrangement in other people's lives had become a man who treated every room he entered as somewhere worth being. Fully. That transformation, from invisible to present, so from displaced to rooted, from performing invincibility to embodying genuine strength, is the real story of Pierce Brosnan. And it deserves a conclusion worthy of everything it took to get here. Here is what the world remembers about Pierce Brosnan: the tuxedo, the Walther PPK, the raised eyebrow, and the line delivered with just enough irony to suggest that the man saying it knew exactly how absurd and thrilling the whole thing was. 4 films, $2 billion. A generation of moviegoers who grew up believing that grace under pressure was simply a matter of the right suit and the right jawline. But here is what the tuxedo never showed. The toddler left behind in Navan while his mother chased a future she could only build without him. The teenager breathing fire in the London cold because it was the first time anyone had ever looked at him. The young husband who stepped back from everything the industry was beginning to offer him and sat beside his wife through 4 years of treatments and fear, and the specific exhaustion of loving someone who is fighting to stay. The man who buried Cassandra, who buried Charlotte, who stood at 2 graves marked by the same disease and found, somehow, a way to transform both losses into something that helps people he will never meet. The actor who was handed James Bond, had it taken away, reclaimed it, lost it again, and responded each time not with bitterness, but with the quiet, almost stubborn resolve of someone who learned very early that the only reliable thing in life is your own willingness to keep moving. Just the husband who chose Keely without reservation and defended that choice without apology. The father who adopted children that weren't biologically his because he understood, from the inside, what it means to be a child who needs to be chosen. The painter who sits alone with canvas and color in the silence that once frightened him and finds there now something close to peace. What does a life like this teach us? Perhaps this, that the things that break us are rarely the things that define us. What defines us is the decision, made quietly, repeatedly, often without an audience, to keep going anyway. To love again after loss. To show up for children when showing up is the hardest thing available. To let your face age and your hair gray and your carefully constructed image of invincibility soften into something more honest and more durable. Pierce Brosnan was never really James Bond. A James Bond was simply the role that gave the world a reason to pay attention long enough to notice the actual man. And the actual man, the boy from Drogheda, the fire eater, the grieving husband, the devoted father, the painter, the advocate, the person who has spent 7 decades learning what it means to truly belong somewhere, is considerably more interesting than any fictional spy could ever be. Because Bond always survives through skill, through gadgets and timing and the convenient architecture of a screenplay. Pierce Brosnan survived through something that cannot be written into a script. He survived through love, through loss, through the unshakable decision, made again and again across a lifetime of reasons not to remain open to both. And that, not the tuxedo, not the franchise, not the $2 billion, is the legacy that will outlast everything else. Not the spy who saved the world. The man who, hard against considerable odds, managed to save himself.